So currently right now, kind of working on my auto rifle hand. Getting prepared, boys, for the upcoming meta. That's right, breakneck, hard light. These two auto rifles that have been criminally punished over the years are now about to take its place at the top of the food chain. Now, close to it, and I would actually say in some cases, maybe even better than it, although we have not played with the new changes yet, is of course this beautiful 720 round per minute auto rifle, Valakadyn. There's some source on the internet, which has to be wrong, that pronounces it Valakadyn. We're just gonna keep it simple and just call it Val. Val here is a year 1 720 round per minute auto rifle that actually returned to us in Forsaken, and with it some random rolls, but at the time I would say 720s, they weren't bad. They just had too many weapons that were stacked against it. I mean, understand when Valakadyn or Val here actually got random rolls, you had things like Luna's Howl in the game way back in its prime. Not forgotten, Bygones was also an extremely deadly weapon in that mid-range and still is, but more so on PC. I would say hand cannons ruled that mid-range, and it wasn't until the range nerf to hand cannons that auto rifles kinda started to creep back into being somewhat viable, although they could still use some more love. Now, the roll that we have here in front of us today was one that caught my eye. It's the super consistent roll that I think many people would overlook, but considering that we've actually reviewed the outlaw kill clip rolls on something like Val, I can tell you right now, the weapon's good, it's got lethality, especially with that roll, but it's just missing that consistency. This roll here in front of us today is actually a Hammerforged rifle roll, which I gotta say, I really like that barrel perk. It gives you a bump there in range without negatively impacting your other stats. We still got ricochet rounds for that bump there in stability, as well as that slight bump in range. Dynamic sway reduction, which is a trait we really don't talk about all too much. When holding down the trigger, this weapon's sway reduction system boosts accuracy over time. A very consistent trait, and we're actually going to weigh the pros and cons to this trait, because I think the thing that pops up a bunch when talking about dynamic sway reduction on weapons is how does it stack against other more consistent traits, say for instance like tap the trigger. Tap the trigger giving you that initial accuracy on the front end, whereas dynamic sway gives you the initial accuracy on the tail end. And then of course, the trait that's just tying everything together here is of course rangefinder. Aiming this weapon increases its effective range and zoom magnification. Now there's something to say about Val. This auto rifle doesn't have any scopes. There's nothing here that's boosting that zoom, and as we know, zoom does affect damage fall off. It's why certain weapons just outclass others, because you have things like scopes that can not only influence that range stat, but also influence that zoom magnification. Now, in comparison to other 720 round per minute auto rifles, and pretty much any other auto rifle, you have a base default zoom magnification of 16. Now, there's actually one other 720 round per minute auto rifle that kind of breaks this mold, and that is, of course, Misfit. Misfit does come with scopes, which does increase that zoom there, and you can actually get a double whammy where it increases the zoom and the range. Now, some people like this and some people don't. Obviously, it does affect that damage range fall off, but at the same time, it literally magnifies your screen. It actually feels like you're that 3 or 4 meters in front of yourself visually, thus resulting in sometimes in short range engagements, this being a problem, as you're almost like over magnifying yourself past what's in front of you. It's a very subtle thing, but it's kind of what's been the debate for something like hand cannons, because some people do like rangefinder on, say, a hand cannon like Spare Rations, and then some people don't, because they purely use their hand cannon inside of that 28, 29 meter range and below. Now, for these auto rifles that are these rapid fire frame auto rifles, they need it. They need anything that could potentially boost that range to allow them to maintain optimal damage to potentially reach that time to kill value of 0.83 seconds. These weapons hit 19 per crit and 13 per body. Now, the reason why we're looking at Valakadyn more specifically is that it actually separates itself from things like Misfit, Reckless Oracle, and even something like the new auto rifle Steel Feather Repeater, simply because it can roll with something like rangefinder. Now, first up, this roll right here that you see in front of you is my Kill Clip Outlaw roll. Not the best roll. I mean, it's not bad. It's got ricochet rounds, but nothing here is boosting that range. Sitting at about a 40 range stat, and it starts to experience damage fall off at 23 meters, which is pretty bad. Again, as we start to receive damage fall off, that 0.83 0.83 second time to kill value optimally, but even that 1.27 time to kill value from the body starts to get extended exponentially there the more damage fall off we receive. Now with Valakadyn and say something like Rangefinder, this actually bumps up our range here, at least with this specific roll, to 27 meters. That is of course with a range boosting barrel perk, a range masterwork, as well as ricochet rounds, and again anything can go in place of ricochet rounds. It just tacks on an extra 5 range. You can have armor piercing rounds there if you want. Ricochet rounds is just nice because it also gives you a stability bump. Regardless, you're looking at about a 4-meter increase there between both of those rolls. Sounds good, right? However, when we compare this to say a simple misfit roll, this is when you get to see zoom in full effect. This roll right here has 51 range, ricochet rounds, snapshot sights, no range boosting masterwork, but it does come with a dust scope D2 sight, which does give us that plus 11 range, but more significantly, it gives us a plus 6 there in zoom. And notice our damage fall off now is 34 meters. We jumped up over 10 meters from the original Valakadyn roll that I just showed you with Outlaw and Kill Clip due to a combination of a little bit of range there, but more so in that plus 6 zoom. That's how important and effective the zoom stat is on your weapons. It's also what separates some of these weapons. And again, it all comes down to you as the player, what you like more, what ranges you put yourself in more. But I will say anything that can boost that range, especially on an auto rifle, also boosts the effectiveness, the stickiness. When you start reaching up there into those 20, 25, 30 meter ranges, you can really start to see deviation in your shots that even if you do have the roll that you see here in front of you, rangefinder, dynamic sway reduction, things that are really boosting that consistency, you'll start to notice some drift in your shot just due to being outside of that optimal range. Now I would say that Valakadyn actually handles itself better, or at least in this case, this specific roll. Rangefinder kind of allows it to stay sticky even past that damage fall off range of 27 meters. And 27 meters is not bad at all, especially on a 720. Most of your engagements are going to be within that range if you're using a 720. And anything outside of that, I would just recommend using a pulse rifle. I mean, when we start looking at things like 30, 35, 40 meters, just put on a pulse. You've got more ease of use, much deadlier options, and it's a lot easier to land a burst of shots versus a continuous spread of shots. Now, even though Misfit does have that crazy range, and it is pretty eye-opening to see how much zoom affects things, Misfit is not the say-all end-all when it comes to 720s. I like Misfit, but similar to something like Art Logic, it's got some terrible muzzle flash. Whether that's intentional on Bungie's part or not, it's something that definitely affects his weapon negatively, thus resulting in me choosing other options like Reckless Oracle, Steel Feather Repeater especially, and in this case, Valakadyn. If you're looking for an auto rifle though, that has that sweet spot between the lethality that say Steel Feather presents, but simultaneously the consistency that Misfit would be able to actually reach had Bungie allowed that weapon to actually behave like a normal non-schizophrenic auto rifle should behave, this rangefinder roll on this Valakadyn is still an excellent option. Now I do want to bring up the dynamic sway reduction perk. Now dynamic sway reduction is really a fancy name for persistence back in Destiny 1, although I think persistence may have actually activated quicker, but it's hard to say. One of the weapons that jumps out to me that roll with persistence is of course Doctrine of Passing, and that trait back then did the same thing that dynamic sway reduction does, which is boost accuracy the longer you hold down the trigger. Currently right now, dynamic sway reduction seems to activate at least on 720 round per minute auto rifles within about 6 to 7 bullets, I would say. You start to really see the weapon center itself and almost make recoil non-existent. And considering that this is a rapid fire frame intrinsically, it has a much larger magazine in comparison to other weapons. Laying on the trigger is just second nature with these weapons. Normally when I get myself in a lane, I just lay on the trigger, I just do it. You almost treat it like a suppressive fire weapon. And with something like dynamic sway reduction being activated pretty much everything south of 6-7 bullets, that in combination with rangefinder does allow for the weapon to stay super consistent. However, in 1v1 scenarios, it may actually be suggested to go with tap the trigger, simply because that does give you that bump there in accuracy as well as stability on the initial trigger pull. So I almost want to look at this in like two ways. Like if I'm looking for a rumble loadout, or if I'm in a game type that does result in me being in a lot of 1v1 scenarios, and I know everything is pretty much going to be done within 15 shots, I may actually go the route of something like tap the trigger. But in any multiplayer engagement where you have multiple opponents in front of you especially if you're laning. I really do like dynamic sway reduction here. Honestly, I wish we had 900 round per minute auto rifles inside of Destiny 2. It's something that Bungie refuses to bring to us. That's what Doctrine of Passing was back in Destiny 1. And when it comes to perk like dynamic sway reduction or say persistence, they really take advantage of those super fast rate of fire weapons. They seem to activate much quicker, probably due to the fact that the rate of fire automatically expends so many bullets at once. Regardless though, the roll that you see here in front of you today, guys, is still a fantastic roll. Now, would I consider something like Valakadyn inside of PvE? Well, it does come with solar burn, and considering that Reckless Oracle is a void damage weapon, Misfit is an arc damage weapon, this kind of leaves Valakadyn there for those solar damage activities. But I will bring up that you have things like Still Feather that can roll with something like Osmosis. I actually have this roll right here, which is Subsistence with Osmosis, and inside of PvE, that is one of the deadliest rolls I can bring into burn activities. It's by far my favorite auto rifle inside of PvE. That is, of course, until this Tuesday when Breakneck gets his buff back. Oh, it's gonna be nasty. Or we hope. That's what we're hoping for, guys. We're hoping for nasty. It may be mediocre at best, but we'll wait and see. Either way it goes though, guys, Valakadyn is a good option for pretty much all activities. It's got a sweet spot between the highest range 720 round per minute auto, simply because it can roll with something like rangefinder. It's got a level of consistency that will allow you to still hang in those mid ranges despite it being a rapid fire frame auto. All of this that I just said will be obsolete when 900 round per minute auto rifles inevitably make its return. Oh, it's coming, fellas. Watch what I say, man. Doctrine of Passing will make its return. Fellas, I hope you learned something today, man. I hope I relayed this information in a clear-cut manner. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Again, we have a hard light buff coming out this week, as well as a breakneck buff. We'll be going over both of those individually, so I'll see you then. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.